We are live. Oh, good. And the mic's working. All right. Let's see. So this is take two of a stream I did earlier this morning, but since I'm still figuring out how all this stuff works, the mic wasn't working right. So I'm going to do it over again. But this morning's stream and now this stream is building off of the stream I did last night which is narcissistic leadership, which I find to be a pretty interesting subcategory of the leadership literature, particularly because it's just really contentious. So this article here, done by two Harvard PhDs, Rosenthal and Pittinsky, back in 2006, titled Narcissistic Leadership, was published in the Leadership Quarterly. And this study is a review and assessment of the theoretical and research literature on narcissistic leaders. And their aim is to understand the both positive and negative consequences of those leadership behaviors. So a lot of times research on narcissistic leadership tends to focus on the negative, but this one's interesting because they suss out some of the positive aspects of narcissistic leadership. So the study's about 17 pages, fairly long, but worth going through. So first kind of section in the study, authors introduce the topic of their paper with the claim that a significant amount of world leaders have grandiose belief systems and leadership styles that connect both their sense of power and, also connects their seemingly inevitable demise due to that narcissistic grandiosity. In addition, world leaders are often depicted as individuals who have aspirations and judgments and decisions that, both good and bad, are often driven by unyielding arrogance and self-absorption. And this is the typical depiction of the relationship between narcissists and leadership. And so the authors contend that a key motivation that leads narcissists to seek leadership positions or positions of power in the first place is their desire to garner the power they need to structure their external world in a way that supports their internal grandiose needs and visions. And they also suggest that the scholarly discussions on this topic to date, this point, it was 2006, have largely centered on narcissism as a personality trait. And furthermore, that the argument is the overall advantage or disadvantage typically depends on the leader and their constituents. And I would add to that it depends on the context. So the author suggests that in order to understand the role of narcissism in leadership and assessing the ramifications of that, it requires a more nuanced approach, which they contend that their study aims to provide. So the next part of the study, they go into a theoretical background on narcissism. They talk about the Greek myth of Narcissus, the person that is obsessed with himself and looks in the mirror, or looks at his own reflection in the pool. And then they talk about Freud, and they talk about some evolution of some of the more contemporary theories of narcissism. They talk about how the negative takes on the theory describe narcissists as people that self-inflate, self-admire. They expect other people to admire them. They have an unusual degree of self-reference and interaction, so they talk about themselves more. They display some contradictions between an inflated self-concept, and they have an inordinate need for tribute from others. They also tend to live shallow emotional lives. They tend to be envious. They tend to have extreme idealization of themselves, and they also tend to have extreme devaluation of others. In addition to that, they tend to be exploitative. They tend to be more charming and engaging than others. which helps conceal their what is otherwise a underlying coldness and ruthlessness and callousness and overall lack of empathy. In contrast to that, the authors also discuss some theories of narcissism that aren't really pathological, with some healthier forms manifesting when narcissism creates humor and creativity and innovation. So they're willing to concede that there's a light and dark side of narcissism early on in the study. But they go on to discuss how the pathological version of narcissism occurs generally when one is unable to integrate the idealized ideas of themselves with the realities of one inadequacies. So they're not able to check themselves with some humility, and they're not able to check themselves with their own shortcomings. The authors also offer a definition from the APA, the American Psychological Association, which I don't think really, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't have a lot of standing because of how politically correct they've become over the years. But nevertheless, they state that to qualify for a diagnosable clinical narcissistic personality disorder, an individual has to exhibit a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, along with a need for admiration and lack of empathy. And that's in quotes. The next section, they go on to lay out the landscape of the literature of narcissism and leadership. They make a claim that this literature tends to focus on one overarching question, and that is it good or bad for a leader to be a narcissist? If, for example, does narcissism provide the necessary drive and vision needed to attain a leadership position, or are all narcissistic leaders doomed to fail? And without getting into what we're going to discuss in the study, I would contend that narcissism provides both the necessary drive and vision needed to attain a leadership position, but also seems to be the reasons for why narcissistic leaders tend not to have longevity once they're in the position of leadership. But in any case, the authors contend that most of the discussion on narcissism in the leadership literature focuses on the effects of a leader's narcissistic traits. And that's because most scholars that study this topic, in addition to other topics in psychology, tend to adopt a trait approach for their analysis. And so their discussions predictably lead to a debate on the relative merits of narcissism in leaders, rather than something more nuanced like these authors are trying to do in their study. So this next section, the authors provide a discussion on the downsides of narcissistic leaders. For example, the visions and plans and actions of narcissistic leaders tend to be synonymous with their own psychological need. For instance, because of a narcissist's need for recognition, they are more likely than others to self-promote and self-nominate. They're also more likely to employ their skills in deception, manipulation, and intimidation so that they can secure those positions of leadership or power, even if they're underqualified for them. And the authors go on to note that although the narcissist's quest for personal glory can sometimes motivate them in the direction of positive, bold, and transformative innovation, even on their best behavior, true narcissistic leaders tend to be bound to leave the systems and relationships under their purview damaged in their wake. They also tend to resist their advisors and mentors' suggestion, which again goes into checking their own inadequacies. And they tend to take more credit for successes than they are due. And so they blame others for their own failures and shortcomings. And they're also highly prone to lapses in professional judgment and personal conduct. So they tend to have a somewhat broken moral compass. But because of their drive and their grandiosity, these narcissistic leaders will still make their poor judgment and decisions, both ethical and moral, with greater certainty and confidence than someone else might. And so they can wield a greater influence on someone that is less narcissistic, despite making decisions that may be morally dubious or morally ambiguous. So the next part of the author's discussion, they provide they offer an exploratory list of some highly interrelated psychological underpinnings of narcissistic leaders. And the list is arrogance, feelings of inferiority, an insatiable need for recognition and superiority, hypersensitivity, anger, lack of empathy, amorality, irrationality, and flexibility, and paranoia. So quite a substantive list, and we're going to go through a couple of them. So in terms of arrogance, the author summarizes part of the discussion by saying that arrogance, in the form of lacking of reality testing, leads to failures based on a narcissistic individual's complacency, inflexibility in their thinking, and short-sightedness, where they ignore important input from their environment, external and internal, from their mentors, from their supervisors, from their subordinates, or even threats from their competitors. In terms of feelings of inferiority, the authors have a pretty interesting take on this. So they suggest that despite their outward arrogance appearance, the theory and research that they cite suggests that the narcissist's grandiose ideas and behaviors may actually be a defense mechanism against deep-rooted negative feelings that they have about themselves. And so these negative feelings are so pervasive that even the defensive pattern of doing something like taking excessive credit for success or burdening their subordinates with blame only temporarily reduces that feeling of inadequacy. It can never fully be alleviated. So it continues to make them be motivated to behave the way that they do. And in the same vein, the narcissistic leaders who constantly self-aggrandize in an attempt to defend against this feelings of emptiness. And then the authors also contend that even when idealized by their subordinates and flattering suck-ups, and imbued with an unquestionable sense of authority, whether informal or formal, that narcissistic leaders still don't have the ability to sustain positive feelings about themselves. And so the slightest mishap or misstep by one of their subordinates can provoke a outsized or dangerous, exaggerated reaction. In terms of the need for recognition and superiority, the authors suggest that the primary mechanism for this coping with a narcissist feeling of inferiority is their unrelenting effort to gain recognition and prove their superiority. So it's just this constant battle of feeling inferior, but fighting to feel superior, and it can never be quenched. And so absolute power, even absolute power can't match a true diagnosable narcissist grandiose expectation. And so rather than give up the pursuit of power or the pursuit of prestige, the author suggests that the narcissist will engage in chronic, all-encompassing efforts for recognition and superiority and attention by embarking on these grandiose projects and also indulging in conspicuous consumption that often leads to darker things like sadism and destructiveness. Savannah, I've never talked to you before, but I'm reviewing a study on narcissism. So I don't claim to be an expert. I'm just talking about things that I like talking about. Anyways, next section in this little discussion of theirs is regarding a narcissist's hypersensitivity and anger. So because these people draw on their feelings of superiority, and in order to overcome that internal sense of inferiority, the authors suggest that a narcissist is more likely to react with extreme hypersensitivity and anger in situations where this grand vision is threatened. And so furthermore, the narcissistic leader can be intense and vengefully hostile as an exaggerated response to an insult, and feels justified in committing that exaggerating response regardless of the consequences. From a lack of empathy perspective, which the authors defined as an inability to understand others' perspective, which is a hallmark of narcissism. And I would say that the ability to be empathetic is a hallmark of good leadership. So, which is why narcissism and leadership are such at odds with each other. Empathy is considered a key emotional intelligence aspect from just a human perspective, but also a leadership perspective. And it's considered as equally as important as traits such as intelligence and mental toughness. The authors seem to think that it predicts perceived leadership independently of other cognitive abilities, such as intelligence, as measured by openness to experience on the Big Five personality factor model, and the ability to perform complex tasks. They also suggest that some even consider empathy a precursor to what they call cognitive leadership abilities, such as perspective taking and pattern recognition, which tend to produce positive leadership outcomes in research. And I would say that checks out with my experience. Like, if you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes, and you can't act in a way that they at least can tolerate being around you, ideally like you're gonna have a lot harder time influencing them, because you just don't know what they want. And so because narcissistic leaders tend to lack empathy, they're really likely to make decisions that are guided by their self-centered, idiosyncratic view of the world, and so they ignore advice or information that conflicts with this view. And they're so sure in their positions, they also expect everyone to see the value in it, and they expect to be simultaneously admired for their decision when it's all done. In terms of morality or amorality, as the authors kind of bucket this, a narcissistic leader moves towards absolute power relative to their environment, and they are also more likely to cross moral and geographical boundaries in ways that place them in vulnerable positions. So they're more willing to buck moral expectations on behalf of the society, or behalf of the organization, behalf of their subordinates, and they're more likely to overreach in terms of their behavior, because they are willing to challenge conventional morality. They tend not to engage in reality testing. And so this behavior it undermines their own leadership, and it invites new challenges to their authority from a moral perspective. In terms of immorality and inflexibility in their thinking, the authors kind of go into this interesting diatribe about the relationship between narcissism and Machiavellianism, which is also another really interesting topic in the leadership literature. But people tend not to touch it, because Again, it's morally contentious. So, in any case, they talk about how the research on these two topics confirm that both narcissism and Machiavellianism are both statistically related, meaning they often appear together in the same person, but they're still distinct traits. Machiavellianism, which is named after Machiavelli, based on the book The Prince, is characterized as rational actions and a willingness to use deceit and cunningness for an expedient leadership or expedient wielding of influence. And so that realpolitik can be characterized as a political leader that uses a practical approach rather than a moral or ideological approach. And these people are more capable of flexibility in their thinking and behavior. They're willing, albeit reluctantly sometimes, to use cruelty and callousness and efforts to consolidate power, and then they moderate their behavior afterwards. And so they avoid being, or they're more likely to avoid being careless and overconfident and using unnecessary harshness, contrasted with a narcissist whose grandiose fantasies and visions become so much a part of their identity and their personality that they tend to be unwilling or unable to consider information to the contrary. So again, they tend to overreach and they tend to undermine their own leadership. This last little bucket here in this study is paranoia, which they suggest is another trait that's commonly found in narcissistic leaders. And so they're prone to create enemies where there had been none originally. And they can see that it's rational for a leader surrounded by suck-ups or sycophants or people that want to ride their coattails to be wary of people's true intentions. The author's position is that a narcissistic leader will go beyond that rationality and cautious, distrusting, and rejecting, and even to the point of destroying the trust of even their most loyal supporters in the process. So that's their discussion of the downsides of narcissism. The next part of their discussion is the upside of narcissism here. So they talk about a bunch of different scholars who propose, a bunch of different observations that the supreme confidence and the dominance that are hallmarks of classic narcissism are, interestingly enough, exactly what inspires a group of followers to select the narcissist to lead in the first place. The authors contend that there are certain types of narcissistic leaders who, when matched with the appropriate set of followers in the appropriate organizational, societal, historical context, not only are constructive for the situation, but they perhaps are a necessity. And so when a narcissistic leader finds a group of ideal, hungry followers, then that leader is in an ideal position to resolve the issues of that group, whatever they may be. And history indicates there are clearly times that call for leaders who have this great vision and dramatic action that's likely to be found in narcissistic leaders. Unfortunately, even when a strong and driven leader that rises to meet these critical situations, historical moments, whatever they may be, the need for them tends to be transient, and it's contextually bound in many cases. So one of the examples that the authors provide is Winston Churchill's rise to power and influence during World War II, and then his rapid fall after the conclusion of World War II, because the British society did not need wartime leadership once the war was over. The authors go on to discuss that there are some scholars who do work in this type of literature that even suggest that modern day's hectic and chaos sometimes, or perhaps even often, necessitate narcissistic leaders who, rather than conservative leaders, play the role of a solid foundation to the institutions that tend to change at a slow pace. These narcissists are the grand visionaries and innovators. So think of Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and all these innovative giants in the last 2 decades. They all tend to display behaviors that are associated with narcissism to some degree, particularly with their apparent lack of empathy, their grand visionary traits, so on and so forth. So they conclude this section talking about how the weaknesses of narcissism, the negative sides to narcissism, can actually be checked with certain things to either mitigate the negative aspects of narcissism or even turn them into positives. So the list of weaknesses that they provide is hypersensitivity to criticism, poor listening, lack of empathy, and an unwillingness or unableness to mentor or be mentored, and an intense competitive nature. So they suggest that when these things are checked with self-imposed humility, self-knowledge, when they're restrained by certain systems and processes that act as anchors within an organization, can actually provide an optimal set of circumstances for productive narcissists to make their vision a reality and foster innovation that an organization might need and advance what otherwise might not be attainable with a more conservative leader. So pretty interesting discussion. The next section, the authors go into a debate of narcissism, where they basically take the last 2 sections that we've been talking about, the upside and the downside of narcissism, and they basically debate themselves for a few pages. They talk about, they ask, is narcissism just extreme self-confidence? Is it necessary to survive and assert our needs? Is there a crucial differentiation needed to identify, grandiosity or just healthy self-esteem and self-confidence? And what is the differentiation? They contend that they think that it's pretty clear that in the literature that the more optimistic theories on the relationship between narcissism and leadership tend to be based on an overly inclusive definition that contains elements of, quote, non-grandiose positive feelings about the self, end quote. So in other words, productive narcissists have perspective and can detach from themselves and laugh at their seemingly irrational needs. So again, they can check themselves. They can maintain enough perspective and humility to keep on learning and to keep on growing and be mentored and mentor other people. And so, in their words, constructive narcissists are confident, thoughtful, realistic, rather than unstable, reactive, and self-deceptive. So in other words, a constructive narcissist has these has these impulses, but also has a healthy ego and is able to check themselves and put things in place that keep them grounded. And so these constructive narcissists, according to the authors, still enjoy being admired. They just have a realistic appreciation of their own abilities and their own limitations. And so the confidence and charisma and optimism that's associated with productive narcissists in this case, in this discussion, are in fact positive leadership traits. And they make a note here that even in military context, that these traits of confidence, charisma, and optimism tend to lead to higher leadership ratings from peers and supervisors. And that would check out with my experience in the military too. So then they go into a little discussion on the flip side of that and talk about how more narcissistic CEOs tend to lead organizations that are both strategically dynamic, which can be a good thing, but also grandiose, which, again, is the overreaching side of them, which leads to more extreme performances of the firm, both to the upside and the downside. And so the authors go on to talk about how there's also a temporal component to this discussion. And they recognize that in most leadership contexts, the qualities needed to form a group may be different from those required to maintain it. And I would suggest that that is true as well. And so the narcissistic leader relies on their well-developed social skills and attractive interpersonal style. But because of that, it becomes a crutch, and they tend to ignore or choose not to develop their management talent. So once they've ascended this ladder into a position of leadership, because they've never had to manage people, they just keep jumping the ladder, and they don't sit in these positions long enough, and they have enough charisma and influence to just get people to do what they want them to do without actually understanding how to manage people and systems. The more or broader their scope becomes, the more that they struggle, because they just don't understand nor care to understand systems and processes. We call that, another way to call that is leadership by personality, which in the time that you are in that position of leadership, you can get a lot done. But once you leave, everything that you put in place tends to fall apart quickly, because these people tend to neglect the systems and processes needed to support those initiatives in the long run. In any case, because of their personality and their interpersonal style and how much they rely on it, it creates a tendency for a narcissistic leader to have a rapid rise and an equally rapid fall. But if they do happen to maintain their power, the author suggests that this is still very costly to the organization, which I would agree with. And this is because their narcissism fuels more and more poor decision-making, and the power that they attain fuels their narcissism, which creates a downward spiral. And so the authors contend that most of the research suggests that the idea of narcissism is positively linked with attaining a leadership position, but it's not necessarily linked with performing well in that position, which I would agree with, and checks out with the live stream that I did last night, talking about how CEOs become CEOs more quickly if they're narcissistic, regardless of whether or not it's a family-owned firm or an open competition. Although that, if you didn't watch the stream last night, a family-owned firm tends to check that narcissism a little bit and slow that trajectory down. But all other things being equal, within a family-owned firm, the narcissist still rises to power faster. And so narcissists tend to receive higher leadership ratings in peer peer evaluation tools like 360 evals compared to the narcissists do early on. But as you spend more time with your subordinates as a narcissist, they tend to see past, the charm and the charisma. And then eventually you start to get your negative reviews that you probably deserve. And so that positive effect will wear off relatively quickly. So they make good first impressions. They're outgoing, they're entertaining, but they're routinely disliked within a short period. So the behavior that makes people like narcissism early on is not repeatable after a certain time. And so that the narcissist tendency to fall out of favor tends to be related to both their overconfidence and overevaluation of themselves and their work, which doesn't match up with their actual ability. So people catch on pretty quick, and this unrealistic optimism about their future performance is rarely adjusted to reflect their actual poor past performance. And even when a narcissist routinely underperforms others, they still maintain that rock solid belief that they are better and will do better than others in the future, which the authors claim that it's not a great recipe for maintaining collaboration or followers. And I would say that that's completely accurate. I think that's hard to argue. But ironically, the traits that propel a narcissist to leadership position, again, it negatively affects their ability to lead in the long run. The next section is the authors discuss they discuss some potential conditions for narcissistic leaders, potential optimal conditions. So they contend that whether narcissistic leaders fail or succeed will depend on both their personality and the circumstances in which they lead. So just like every other leadership discussion, it always has to include considerations for the individual and considerations for the context. And so, we could expect that narcissists succeed in positions where their charisma and extroversion are important, departments such as sales, or where self-absorption and grandiosity are important, such as science, where you're promoting yourself and you're advocating for yourself and the work that you're trying to do, as opposed to positions that require sustained relationships and trust. So something more long-term, a little more stable, bigger groups of subordinates, more interpersonal dynamics, more reliance on one another, the narcissist tends to struggle in. We could also expect narcissists to lead better in situations where their personal goals converge with the goals and agendas of their followers and the institutions, rather where their success is likely to come at the expense of those around them. So, nothing earth-shattering there, but narcissists do better whenever their personal agendas are nested in the agendas of everyone around them. But I would say that that's true for everybody, narcissists or otherwise. And narcissists are also apt to emerge and flourish in times of uncertainty and complexity and chaos, where there's a new order that needs to be established. So they can be really good change agents, as long as what I said before is true, where they have an ability to keep themselves humble and grounded. Unfortunately, they're not able to maintain the necessary stability once that new order has come to fruition. So the dynamics needed for a strategic change in an organization are not the same things that are needed to maintain the processes and systems once that change is maintained. And so narcissists will thrive in that chaotic and dynamic, fast-paced environment, but they tend to be out of place and struggle and even destructive in more stable or tranquil times for an organization or a society or what have you. So the next section is talking about um, whether or not, if you're a narcissistic leader, are you able to uh, avoid the downfall common with narcissists? So they go into talking about a few different leadership theories, one of which is called the implicit leadership theory, which suggests that people choose leaders who seem most leader-like, sometimes regardless of whether or not they can actually lead once they're there. And so that if they suggest that if this is generally true, then we can expect it to be especially true of narcissistic leaders. So again, the degree to which people choose their leaders because they seem most leader-like, a narcissist will seem more leader-like and therefore be chosen more. And according to them, followers will tend to perceive really charismatic narcissists as almost superhuman, and they'll blindly believe them and follow them unconditionally and give them an unqualified emotional support, whether or not they deserve it. And so these leaders are more likely to go on to abuse their power and exploit their charisma, and they're more likely to convince the people that are following them to buy into these grandiose visions, regardless of how abusive and how much they're forced to shoulder the blame for the failures of this narcissistic leader. And then those who aren't tricked and aren't swayed by the charisma of the narcissistic leader still tend to be intimidated into subordination. So the narcissistic leader still tends to get what they want, at least in the short term. They go on to discuss what they call a more provocative theory on the rise of narcissistic leaders. And I found it to be fairly interesting. So they suggest that the rise of a narcissistic leader and their selection to a position of leadership may in fact be because their personality complements the narcissism of their followers. And the narcissistic leader who is constantly seeking confirmation and admiration from their followers complement the same followers who themselves feel incomplete as individuals and only feel complete so long as that they can be related to that individual whom they can admire for their prestige and their power and beauty and intelligence and influence and moral stature and so on and so forth. And so the author suggests that this phenomenon may be especially prevalent in moments of great historical threat, when people who are normally psychologically sound and psychologically self-sufficient are made vulnerable by external threats. So again, think Germany post World War I. So there's three things that the authors pose as options to avoid the downfall if you're a narcissistic leader. The first one is that narcissistic leaders need to have a trusted confidant or mentor who is rooted in reality. That external system or process that checks their own sense of self. Second is that if the organization can be completely indoctrinated to accept and subordinate itself to the ideology of the leader, then the narcissistic leader will be successful, even if that's actually not a good thing. And then third, the narcissistic leader should get intensive psychotherapy, which I think is kind of a write-off and a no-brainer. They note that the first and third options will require, a confidant and a therapist who are both psychologically immune to the what they think are inevitable attacks on the narcissistic leader, who forces them to endure their behavior. And then the second option, the authors admit that even though a subordinated organization may be more internally peaceful because their ideologies are aligned, that any deficiencies in the leader's ability is going to be greatly magnified and lead to poor outcomes for the organization. So any mistake you make as a narcissistic leader who has an organization that is aligned with your ideology is going to cause more damage, because there's no one there to question and to take a hammer to your idea and see if it still holds up to logic and reason. So the authors admit that the feasibility and effectiveness of all three of these approaches are questionable. They note that there are some less passive safeguards are organizational checks and balances, honest feedback, executive training, yada, yada, yada. Nothing really that's super helpful, but worth implementing if you're in a position to do so. They say you can avoid the problem as much as possible, reduce the individual's influence, transferring them out of harm's way, keeping inexperienced and insecure subordinates out of their way. And they go on to say that while these suggestions could be advisable for those who wish to optimize their leadership abilities, it's less clear whether or not a narcissistic leader would be agreeable to any of them. The next section of the study discusses how narcissism relates more to contemporary leadership models, specifically power motivation and charismatic leadership. So, power is something that narcissists crave. Charisma is something that narcissists have in spades, but they're all separate, but they're all distinct models. So they note that it's clear that power is a great motivator for the narcissist. However, when they reach the pinnacle of entrenched power or formal power, they still crave and seek more of it. And so they do so at risk to themselves and their followers. So there's a degree of overlap between narcissistic leaders and leaders whose main influence is power motivation, but the differences are important. And so leaders high in power motivation seek to acquire prestige and influence by building their reputations so that they can make an impact on others. So there's more of a benevolent flavor to it. And their search for strength through influence rather than individual achievement and charisma is a means for nurturing the success of their subordinates and institutions. So they seek to achieve power in a manner that's benevolent. They tend to want to make subordinates feel stronger, more capable, more responsible, rather than weak and incompetent and powerless like a narcissist would. And so leaders high in power motivation, they tend not to concern themselves with being liked like a narcissist would. They tend to be more concerned with having a positive impact, or what they perceive as a positive impact on others, rather than any sort of self-aggrandizement, because of their self-image is lacking, and they don't see it as contingent on their performance or their ability to dominate those around them. Contrast that to a narcissistic leader who's more likely to have an egotistical and aggressive style, and they tend to focus on maintaining their own interests and strength rather than developing others around them. And they tend to lead with the ultimate goal of impressing their superiors so they can acquire more power and influence, rather than managing and leading and developing their subordinates, which I think is the mark of a good leader. They go on to note that the key difference between these two is that a narcissistic leader need for the trappings of power is fundamentally motivated by their ego, whereas someone with a high power motivation suggests that striving for ego enhancement is merely a byproduct or consequence of that leader's fundamental need for personal power so they can do the positive things that they're motivated to do. As far as narcissism and charismatic leadership go, the authors contend that charisma is clearly and unanimously a key factor in the popularity and the ascendancy of leaders. So there's clearly a significant overlap between charismatic leadership and narcissistic leadership. However, charismatic leadership tends to emerge when authority or influence is granted to an individual by their devoted followers, whom they consider these followers consider this leader to be exceptional and transcendent to some degree. Charismatic leaders tend to be socially and intellectually gifted people who are more likely to emerge in times of crisis and complexity and chaos, where their radical solutions are actually called for and perhaps needed. And in doing so, they're able to attract followers through the use of their charisma, and then they validate their followers' belief in them through repeated success. Unlike the narcissist, who is charismatic but may not measure up to the competence needed to actually lead in chaotic and times of crisis. And so charismatic leadership operates best when followers' identities when followers identify with both the leader and the mission, when they link the leader to the mission, and they can feel the leader and the mission are closely tied with their own self-concepts and their own agendas. The author's last section, they make an attempt to put forth a more comprehensive and accurate definition of narcissistic leadership. They kind of review some of the ideas that they discussed earlier. They suggest that narcissism generally seems to be seen and perhaps is a negative trait, at least until, in terms of its relationship to leadership, at least until its attributes are checked with other attributes like humility and perspective taking and are integrated into its definition, at which point the utility of narcissistic leaders emerge, according to the authors. And so they offer their own definition of narcissistic leadership, which is, quote, occurs when leaders' actions are principally motivated by their own egomaniacal needs and beliefs, superseding the needs and interests of the constituents and institutions they lead, end quote. And they define egomaniacal needs and beliefs to include patterns pervasive in the clinical definition of narcissism, which again is grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power and excessive need for admiration, entitlement, lack of empathy, envy, inferiority, and hypersensitivity, end quote. So there's some interesting discussion here, but basically the authors spend like 15 pages discussing narcissistic leadership, saying it needs a new definition, only to rewrite what I think is just another common definition of narcissistic leadership. But whatever, it was still an interesting study. And I'm talking to myself again. Okay. At least my mic's working this time. So Ryan's got a question here. As a subordinate, how do you work with a narcissistic manager, and what are ways you can manage up and influence them? So one of the common themes here in this study and a lot of the studies I've seen on narcissistic leaders and my own personal experience with them is their ego is a big influence on their decision making, how they perceive you, how credible they perceive you to be. So, and this isn't limited to just narcissistic leaders. I think this is a good strategy for all situations where you're trying to influence up, is make the person that's leading you, narcissistic or otherwise, look good. Make them look good to their bosses, make them look good to their subordinates, and they're going to like you more. And the more they like you and the more credible you are with getting done what they want done, the more maneuverability that they're going to provide you with. Now, they may not provide you with as much maneuverability as you would like them to, and they may not micromanage you as little as you would like them to, but that's one of the better ways to move the needle in the direction that you want it to be moved in. So you might not get, your ideal situation, but playing to the ego and making your supervisor, narcissistic in this case, look good, it's going to improve the conditions for you. So you got to swallow your own ego to deal with narcissists. Or if you happen to be in charge or a supervisor to a narcissist, you isolate them. But in this case, it doesn't sound like that's the issue. All right, I'll stay on for 2 more minutes. All right, never mind. I'm ending the stream. I'll be back on around 6 p.m. this evening.